welcome to another episode of What Are You Reading? What Are You Writing? I am so glad that you chose to join us today. I am your host, Karen E. Osborne, author of women's suspense fiction, Getting It Right, Tangled, I had to think for a minute, Tangled Lies, Reckonings, and then my new historical fiction, True Grace. And I am so excited to introduce you to my guest today. This is Barbara J. Haler. Hey, Barb.
Hey, Karen, I am so excited to be here. Thank you so much.
Oh, I can't wait for our talk and for our audience to get to know you. So, Barbara is the author of the Scranton Trilogy. She has three books that all take place where she is sitting right now in Scranton, Pennsylvania. Her final book in the series is called, we're going to have to talk about these titles. I'm really curious. So,
Oh, good.
this one is called Rain Breaks No Bones. Now, how cool is that for a title? You want to know what she's talking about, don't you? This is historical fiction, a family saga, and a book about secrets, shame, guilt, and how the past can disrupt the future. So I just can't wait to dive in. This sounds so intriguing. I have so many things I want to ask you.
I love it.
So let's start with the inspiration for the trilogy. Did you always know it was going to be three books? Did that just happen? Tell us about it.
Great question. I had no idea. Back in 2006, I was a full-time teacher. I taught in the Pocono Mountains School District for 31 years. I loved my career, but at about the 20-year mark, I was itchy to do something else, so I went back to school. And Wilkes University has a creative writing program, and that's where I wrote the first draft of my first book, Sing in the Morning, Cry at Night. And the beauty of the Wilkes program is that when you finish your work, they send it to an outside reader. Mine turned out to be an agent. And when I spoke to the agent, who turned out to be my agent, the wonderful Chris Tomasino, she said to me, when we sell this, a publisher is going to want you to write three books in the same genre. They're going to invest in getting you an audience and so forth. So they can be three different stories or a trilogy. And so I thought about it and I decided that these characters had more to say, but the books are each 20 years apart and they're separate stories. So you can read them in any order, but it's the same family, and the trauma from the first book seeps and finds its way through the other two, hopefully to a resolution.
Yeah. So, so that's a wonderful description of the process. But what inspired the actual story? Like, what were you thinking about when you started writing this?
Right. Well, with the very first book, it's very loosely based on a family story. So in real life, my maternal grandmother's sister, Pearl, she was 7 years old, almost 8. It was the day of her baptism. They were Protestant, and it was also the 4th of July. And that evening, she and her friends and her sister were playing with sparklers, and her dress caught on fire. She survived for 3 days. And in that time, she sang hymns, never a word of complaint. So when she passed away, people from all over Scranton came to view the body of the little girl who sang hymns. And I heard that story. I grew up with that story. I've always been very dramatic. So I soaked it up. And as tragic as that was, of course, for the whole family and for Pearl, I always wondered about her sister who was in the yard with her. That would be my Aunt Janet. In my book, I call her Violet. But my Aunt Janet didn't have the happiest life. And I always wondered how much of that was connected to what she witnessed that day. You know, they didn't have therapy. They didn't have,
Right, right.
you would like just move on. And so I just wondered how much of that she carried with her. And so that was really the inspiration for the first book. And then the idea of generational trauma and so forth, that story, even though it's in the first book, it affects the characters all the way through.
Yeah,
So the
just
first
like in
book is,
real life.
yeah, the first book is 1913, the new one is 1955, but it's still affecting everyone. And like,
Yeah, yeah, wow, generational trauma, absolutely.
mhm.
So, so so now we're following this family, and we've gotten to Rain Breaks No Bones. So what's the premise of that?
Rain Breaks No Bones. It has a secret birth. It has a complicated relationship, a shocking death, and no one is talking, not even the dead. So it's a little bit of a ghost story. This one's a little different for me. It's set in Scranton in 1955. So that's the time when the coal industry was in decline, the civil rights movement was heating up, and Hurricane Diane was preparing to hit land. So there's a lot going on. Scranton has such a rich history because of the mining industry. We're near New York. Vaudeville was big here, so there's just so much to pull from, and so that's the setting of the story.
Wow, wow, that sounds amazing. Um, so all of your reviews talk about your vivid cast of characters. I was reading the reviews for your book, and so whose story is this? You know,
That's a great
who
question.
is your lead story, your main character, and what do you like about her?
That is such a good question because when I was simply an English teacher, that is a question I would ask and expect that there was an obvious answer. And yet now that I'm a writer, I see that there can be a gray area. So in the first book, it was Violet, the little girl, but also Grace, her mother. And it was, those were really, my books are very female centric. The men are wonderful too, but I think it's based on the women in my life. And those two characters, the mother daughter, in the first book, I think had equal weight. But then as the trilogy progressed, Violet became the real protagonist. And by the time I was writing the character of Violet in the third book, Violet is now 50. I'm 60, but when I started the book, I was in my 50s. So I almost felt this kinship with her because I had a sense of what she was thinking about. You get to a certain age and suddenly time is just flying by and you're thinking about your purpose and all of those things. So I felt that kinship with her when I was writing. So I would say ultimately it's Violet.
Beautiful. That is really beautiful. So show us the gorgeous books. Show us your books.
Well, this is my first book, Sing in the Morning, Cry at Night. And what happened with this one, I'll just mention because you mentioned the titles before. When this book was first going to be published, it had a completely different cover, completely different title. It was called Providence Square because that's the neighborhood where all of this takes place. And my publisher in New York said, it sounds like Rhode Island. So we went through a series of different titles. We were brainstorming for the cover. The distributor didn't like the old cover. So I became aware of how many people have a say in what happens with your book. So in the end, I had all of these great family photos that inspired my story, but there wasn't one that was strong enough for the whole cover. So I came up with the collage idea. So once that happened, we had to stick with it. So sing in the morning, cry at night is an old Welsh proverb. And the main family, the Morgans in the book, they're Welsh. So that's where that came from. So then All Waiting is Long is my second book. And again, lots of family photos or photos that I collected to inspire my characters. And
Mm.
All Waiting is Long. It's another Welsh proverb, which I love because all waiting, whether it's good or bad, it's long.
Long.
It's long. And then this is my new one. I'm very excited. This book is Rain Breaks No Bones. And again, I have a lot of family photos. You can't see, but there's a group of bathing beauties, and my mother is the second one from the right. So it's fun that I can put real people in there that I know. And again, photos that I also collect to inspire me. So this was the third. Rain Breaks No Bones. Little Rain Never Hurt Anybody. That's the idea. And that was that was that was the title this time.
Very cool beans. So things that really intrigued me
Mhm.
was that in the current book, you have an interracial love story. And, and I don't know if anyone's asked you this before, but you know, was that a comfortable thing for you to write about? Was that um, were you worried in any way? I have writer friends that write me and ask me, could you just read this to make sure it's culturally okay? And so I just kind of wondered about your thinking there and what the challenge might have been, or if there was a challenge.
A huge challenge. That is a great question. This book took me longer than my other books. Part of it, I wasn't very productive during COVID and with the political climate, so that sort of shut me down for a while. But the other thing that shut me down was writing the interracial relationship. And I have Johnny, who's Black, I have Daisy, who's white, and so they're dating. But then I also introduced some other Black characters. And I always knew this was where the book was going. Once I realized it was a trilogy, I knew that with each book, their world would get bigger, the Morgan family. So I always knew this was where we were headed. But when it came time to write it, I was paralyzed with fear. I wanted to do it right. I also didn't know if it was my place to do it. I was trying to figure out my whole place. I was reading anti-racism books. I was of course absorbing everything that was happening in the news, talking to friends, and I just there's a story in Scranton. There is an African American Scrantonian story to be told. That's not my story to tell, and I know
Mm,
that. But also, I don't think any writer should be limited as to a box of I can only write these characters. So I was struggling with that. And then at some point, I was talking to a friend of mine who happens to be Black, who is an incredible memoirist. And she said to me, I know your heart. Write the book and then do the work. And so what I did was I did what I always do with researching historical fiction. I read the magazines that were written by Black authors at the time. I never read work that's been written about the time. I read what was written during the time. So I read the magazines. I read the books, the newspapers. I interviewed people I knew, but also people I met through other people because I wanted that Scranton experience. What was it like to be Black in Scranton? And what was it like to be a, a child of an interracial couple? So I did all that research, wrote the book. And then what I did was this time when I hired editors, I hired three wonderful writers who happened to be African American. And I will tell you what, boy, did they straighten me out. In terms of the biggest problem, and I knew it. My friend Vilinda Bryant, she's amazing, and she made this book so much better. Um, when I was writing the characters, I was so afraid of offending that I would do this thing where Johnny and Daisy would be just about to confront something and about their relationship. And I'd have one or the other say, oh, let's not talk about this now. Let's just have a good time. And I just completely sidestepped the issue. And I mean, Vilinda, Lynn Bryant just set me straight as to all the opportunities that I missed and how if I was going to do this, I better do it. And so, ultimately I did my due diligence and we'll see how the world receives it. But
that's
but I really
wonderful.
did try. Yes.
Yeah. And how awful it would be if we could only write about
Yes.
whatever our identity is, however we think about it. If I could only write about older women, if I could only write
Right.
about Black people, if I could, I would just be, none of my books would have gotten out. None of them.
There you go. There you exactly. And it was me. I was stopping myself because I was, you try to do the right thing, but then you get caught in that, am I being too
You question yourself.
questioning myself?
Yes.
And
Yes.
and so I just did it. And for me, it was challenging and brave, and we'll see what happens. But for the record, I do the same kind of research with every other kind of character whose background I need to understand. understand. So I did what I know to do, but for some reason in that moment, you know, you write, you've written lots of books. I don't know if this happens to you, but I forget how to write. Like I'm in the middle of a book and I think, oh, I know what I can do. Sure, that's what I did with the first book. Why didn't I remember that? So I did what I knew to do, but it took me a while to get there. And I will tell you, Zethray, who's not part of the relationship, but she's just an amazing, she's everyone's favorite character. She's mine too. She's actually based on a friend, Zethray. So I love that too. So the love is there.
Well, the nicest thing that you said, I will just say, the nicest thing I heard you say is that I checked with my friends. I can't
Mm,
tell you how many people don't have friends outside of who they are, however they think about themselves.
right.
And so it's just so wonderful that or I'm the only friend they have outside
Mhm.
of of their world. And it's such a wonderful thing to say, and I asked this friend and I asked this friend and the three people. So go Barb.
Thank you.
I'm
Thank you.
sure
Thank you.
I'm
Yeah.
sure it is
Yeah.
beautiful, beautiful.
But
So
I will say, I grew up in Scranton, but then I moved, and a lot of my friends were from out of state too. So I also had to cultivate some new relationships, and that was wonderful too. So
yes,
it was an enriching experience for me all the way around. So I will say that.
sounds very good. Sounds excellent.
Thank you.
So as you think about books that you have read that
Mm.
had a profound impact on you in some way. Maybe they got you wanting to write historical fiction, maybe they taught you things or had a profound impact on your life. Can you think of a writer or a book that's had that kind of impact on your life?
I, there are so many books that have had an impact, and especially as an English teacher. But I will tell you, as a writer, many years ago, I read Ironweed by William Kennedy. And that book starts in a cemetery. And we're getting Francis's thoughts. He's going to work at the cemetery. And it all seems, it's interesting, but fairly normal, a normal read. And then all of a sudden, we're underground and the dead are speaking. And they're not the most, saintly souls.
Yes.
The one woman is griping and she's braiding crosses out of dandelion weeds, and the other one is smoking his pipe. They're as human as the people above ground. And I remember, and I wasn't formally writing yet, I remember reading that book and thinking, you can do that? Like that. I don't know why that book in that moment, because I'd read magical realism, I'd read other, but there was something about, I think because it was close to my wheelhouse as far as a family story and so on. And so it was very realistic, except where it wasn't. So I just remember reading that and thinking, wow. And then years later, I got to meet him at Wilkes University and tell him what a difference he made in my life as a writer.
Oh, that is wonderful. I
Yeah,
hope he responded really warmly.
absolutely.
Okay, good. I'm
Absolutely.
glad.
Yes,
That
yes.
doesn't always happen, unfortunately.
In fact, I have a picture of us right here. You
Ah,
can't really see it,
cool.
but he was lovely. He was
Oh,
lovely.
I'm so glad to hear
Yeah.
that. And finally, is there a book that you can recommend that you've recently read? One or two, no more.
Okay, okay. So I'm in the process of reading right now. So well, you know what I'm going to recommend before I finish it? I am reading Knife by Salman Rushdie, and
Mm,
it's memoir about the attack, but
yeah.
also for those people who are writers, my goodness, the writing advice and the beautiful phrases, it's a study in writing. So I would highly recommend that. Um, you know what? The book I always go back to, and this is an old one, is Their Eyes Were Watching God. I would recommend that to anybody. Zora Neale Hurston. Um, Again, it's about storytelling. That's just, I find writing interesting when it's experimental, but ultimately, I just want a good
Good
story.
story. Yep.
And I go back to that. And the first time I read it was actually audio, and it was Ruby Dee narrating. And my God, the
Wow.
combination, I am telling
Wow.
you, you have a road trip to take, get the Ruby Dee narration of Their Eyes Are Watching God. I love that book.
You
Love
know,
it.
when you have an actor reading as opposed to a reader reading, it makes all the difference. I just posted recently that my next listen is going to be Whoopi Goldberg's newest book because
Mhm.
so many people throughout my career, I was a public speaker, I spoke all over the world, would say, "You know who you sound like?" And I would just roll my eyes. But when you hear it 30, 40, 50
Right.
times, so I started telling people, A, I'd really like you to go up to Whoopi and say, "Do you know who you sound like?" And B, I wanna listen to her read her latest memoir. I'm looking forward to it. So now that you've got everyone totally fallen in love with you, and they can't wait to read your books, tell
Uh-huh.
everybody how they can find you. Where can they find out more
Yeah.
about you? How can they be in touch with you? How can they get your books?
You're wonderful. The easiest way is to go to my website, which is barbarajtaylor.com. And there you can find where I am on Facebook, where I am on Threads, where I am on Instagram, and also send an email, ask me a question. I love hearing from readers. I truly do. So that's probably the easiest, barbarajtaylor.com.
Excellent, excellent. And so I know you all are going to be in touch with Barbara, and then you're going to follow her. Following is so important. I hope you're already following me on my YouTube channel, Karen E. Osborne, on my author page, Karen E. Osborne Author, and on my website, just like Barb, I just use my name. So it's just KarenEOsborne.com. And when you do get in touch with Barb, please tell her that you met her on What Are You Reading? What Are You Writing? See you all next Tuesday. Bye.